Welcome all, ladies and gentlemen, His Excellencies, students, members of the diplomatic community. We have the pleasure of hosting today at Middle East Technical University the 5th event of Kuwaiti Cultural Season in Turkey. The season started in December, and we have been witnessing many important events which were held by the Kuwaiti Embassy. And our aim through organizing this panel is actually to discuss, to share our ideas, and of course to enhance Turkish-Gulf relations. And as Middle East Technical University, we are very pleased to be hosting this event, and we have 4 interesting talks. At least 3 of them, I'm sure, are very interesting because the 4th is mine. So we have 3 speakers and myself as the 4th. I'm Özlem Tür. I'm the chair of Department of International Relations. I mostly work on Turkey's relations with Syria, Israel, and Lebanon. We have 3 distinguished speakers with us. We have Professor Meliha Altunışık, who was the former chair of our department and also the former head of Social Science Institute, and now she's the provost of our university. Professor Altunışık has worked extensively on Turkey's relations with the Middle East, has a record publication, number of publications on Turkey's soft power in the region, and as you can see from the leaflets, she has many works, and the last one is the South Caucasus and the Middle East, and also the Great Game in West Asia, Iran, Turkey, and the South Caucasus. So Professor Altunışık will be talking first today. She will be talking about the future opportunities and challenges in Turkey-GCC relations. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Sami Al-Faraj. Dr. Al-Faraj was educated as Kuwaiti Military Academy and in various universities in Kuwait, in Cambridge, in the US, and in the UK at Oxford. And he is currently the Kuwaiti Center for Strategic Studies director. She teaches and trains senior managerial levels in the civilian, military, and security sectors, and is a leading figure in Kuwaiti Academy. He will be talking about the strategic aspect of Turkish-Kuwaiti relations. Then I will be talking about the economic aspect of Turkish-GCC relations. And then we will be turning to Shafiq Al-Gabra, who is a professor of political science at Kuwait University and is also the visiting scholar at the Arab Center at Doha. He has published extensively on various aspects of Kuwait and on Palestine. He has most recent works. One of them is Kuwait and the Dynamics of State and Society. And I think we will be seeing an English translation of his book. In English, I think the title will be Unsafe Life, The Generation of Dreams and Disappointments. And he has a forthcoming work, which is The Nakba and the Emergence of the Palestinian Diaspora in Kuwait. And he will be talking about the Jerusalem issue, the Palestinian issue in general in Turkish-GCC relations. So we look forward to questions and answers after we finish our talks, and we look forward to this panel. So Professor Altunışık, would you like to go first?
In my talk, what I will try to do is to talk about Turkey-GCC relations in general terms and try to give sort of some kind of a framework. And in doing so, I will talk about 3 sub-periods in understanding Turkey-GCC relations. The first sub-period is the first decade of the 2000s. And this decade was characterized by rapprochement between Turkey and the GCC. The second sub-period is the period that started with the Arab uprisings. So the impact of the Arab uprisings, I called it, and this was a period where Turkey and the GCC tried to manage their relationship in a rapidly shifting strategic and political environment. And the third period is more problematic, I would say, and it starts with 2017, so we may say, the last 2 years. And here there are more divergences and problems, and I will try to give my take on where these problems originate from, and then say a few words about Turkey-Kuwait relations and whether Kuwait is well situated to play an important role in the improvement of Turkey-GCC relations as well. The first period that I'm going to look at is, as I said, the first decade of the 2000s, which was characterized by rapprochement. And in fact, during this period, Turkey's relations with GCC improved considerably. There were several reasons for that. The first reason was, again, yet another transformation in regional politics. We are talking about post-2003 period here, which has been very important for regional politics. And in fact, in some ways, we are still living in the post-2003 era, I may say, because the trends that were unleashed by the US invasion of Iraq are still with us. Maybe they were accentuated with the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, but they were there since 2003. So that regional context, I think, led to a rapprochement between Turkey and the GCC. From the GCC side, albeit in varying degrees, there was an increasing concern about what these countries perceived as rising Iran power in the region, not only in the Gulf, but in the region as a whole, because of the declining role of Iraq as a buffer between Iran and the rest of the Middle East. So there was an increasing sense of threat in the GCC countries, as I said, albeit in varying degrees. In that, the GCC, and particularly Saudi Arabia as well, perceived Turkey as an important counterweight to Iran in the region. And Saudis were also attempting to sort of create a Saudi-led Sunni bloc, and for that Turkey was seen as an indispensable ally as well. Why was Turkey interested? Turkey had its own reasons. First of all, I think there was the AKP factor, because this was the period where AKP came to power, and AKP was interested for ideological and material reasons to be more engaged with the Middle East, and there were several attempts to be more influential in the region, and you may even say some aspirations for a leadership role. So that was a factor, and related to that, there were economic reasons. For economic reasons, Turkey wanted to engage more with the GCC. Of course, for the GCC, Turkey was an important country to invest as well, so there was an economic interest on both sides. As a result, in the first decade of the 2000s, we witnessed an unprecedented level of improvement in relations between Turkey and the GCC. And for Turkey, therefore, the Gulf emerged as one of the focal points of its Middle East policy. Of course, there are, specific examples to show how relations improved. In 2008, Turkey and GCC signed a memorandum of understanding, and this was very significant because this made Turkey the first country outside the Gulf region to have the strategic partnership with the GCC. And that memorandum envisioned regular dialogue at the foreign ministers level every year, although that later was not realized as every year, but they have only met, I think, only 5 times since then. But clearly, this memorandum showed the eagerness on both sides to improve relations. Very significant within that context was then Saudi King Abdullah's visit to Turkey, twice actually. The first one being in 2006. It was significant because it was after 40 years that a Saudi king visited Turkey. So in that sense, it was a significant visit. And another visit followed just a year after. This demonstrates the eagerness on both sides to develop relationship. So that was the first decade of the 2000s, and really as a result, I'm sure Professor Tur will talk about, the economic relations also started to pick up, investment, Gulf investment in Turkey started to pick up, and political relations and dialogue began. Then came the Arab uprisings, yet another transformative event, not only for the countries that experienced this, but also for the region as a whole. I mean, the region as a whole was affected by this, and the political status quo started to transform. This, of course, introduced a new uncertainty to the relationship between the Gulf and Turkey as well. Both the GCC and Turkey were trying to understand the implications of the Arab uprisings and their positions within it. And in that, we started to see some divergences because Turkey, almost right from the beginning, perceived opportunities in the Arab uprisings because, the Turkish government thought that the developments as a result would be beneficial for Turkey's interest. The regime changes would allow Turkey to be even more influential in the region and in different countries, and therefore became very supportive of this transformation in the region, whereas the GCC countries had their own doubts about it. They were more ambiguous compared to Turkey about the Arab uprisings. And clearly there was a divergence, for instance, which was an important divergence that affected the general atmosphere of the relationship, and that was Egypt. Egypt really became a symbol of this divergent views between Turkey and the GCC, where most of the GCC countries were not happy about the toppling of Mubarak and coming of power of Morsi. The AKP government was welcoming this development, and in fact thinking that Muslim Brotherhood movements coming to power like in Egypt would be beneficial for Turkey's interests and would help Turkey to enhance its influence in the region. So in a way, Egypt was the first sign of this divergence. But nevertheless, during this period, the relationship could still be managed because there was a convergence over Syria. So both sides thought that, you know, they could cooperate over Syria, and both Turkey and the GCC countries made this a point that Syria is a case where they could cooperate. And in fact, they decided about cooperation and coordination over Syria. In fact, even you know, cooperation against Iran, because Turkey was also starting to be concerned about rising Iranian influence now, especially through its involvement in Syria. So there was yet another common point emerging to some extent, and also in their fight against Daesh. And in fact, in November 2016, the dialogue convened after a while in Riyadh and approved a 38-point program, a statement advocating cooperation in different areas, stronger economic ties, very interestingly military ties, and there were several agreements and implementation of these military agreements between the GCC and Turkey, and shared commitment to territorial integrity of Iraq, for instance, another common point that was underlined there, and determination to join in the fight against terrorism. And for Turkish government's pleasure, in October 2016, the GCC also designated the Gülen movement as a terrorist organization. You know, this was very much welcomed by the AKP government as well. So this period was kind of interesting, 2011 and 2017, because although there were clear divergences emerging in this rapprochement, both the GCC and Turkey were trying to sort of manage this relationship and trying to emphasize on areas where they seem to converge, you know, Syria or Iraq, or fight against terrorism, economic and military ties. So they try to sort of isolate areas of their divergence and emphasize convergences in their relations. But since 2017, this situation of managing a relationship became difficult to sustain. And here I identified basically five, 4 points, and I would argue that these, for these reasons, you know, it became difficult for the GCC and Turkey to manage their relationship as they did after the Arab uprising, despite, you know, suspicions and divergences. Okay, what are these? What are the reasons of this divergence, or this the developments that make it difficult to manage the relationship? I think one factor emanates from the GCC itself. Of course, I mean, it is needless here to talk about the GCC as a sub-regional organization and its development. There was always, you know, differences of opinion within the GCC, although I generally think that I give it as an example in my classes, you know, in the Middle East, where we don't see many examples of institutionalization and regionalization. The GCC, for all its weaknesses, I think is an example of you know, certain success in institutionalization and sub-regionalization. But since 2017, the GCC began to suffer from open divergences within the organization. The Gulf subsystem, it seems, is going through some transformation, and we began to witness major foreign policy splits within the GCC. I mean, you may say that they existed even before. Of course they did. But what has been interesting since 2017 is that these foreign policy splits proliferated and more importantly, started to be discussed openly, and they became visible to others. So I think this is rather new, both in terms of proliferation of disputes and also, having these foreign policy splits among the states of the GCC openly. Since the Arab uprisings, Gulf states have taken different positions in Egypt with respect to Muslim Brotherhood, particularly Qatar here had a very different view. They have supported different opposition groups in Syria. They have disagreed over relations with Iran. Although I think all GCC countries have their concerns about Iran or its rise in the region, but the way they approach it and their approach to managing this issue started to differ. And Qatar crisis, I think, was the apex of this, these foreign policy splits within the GCC. And I think this, of course, this is an important event in itself, obviously, but this had repercussions for Turkey's relations with the GCC, because Turkey, after a while, felt the need to take sides in this, because the split was really, with the Qatar crisis, really became very clear, and Turkey took side with Qatar, and that created a rift between Turkey's relations with the rest of the GCC. Why did Turkey, take this position? This is something we have been discussing in Turkey as well. There are maybe you can come up with several explanations. One is more of a conspiracy, explanation, which basically, and this was actually voiced by the government officials in different contexts, and this is related to Turkey's concern that somehow Qatar crisis is the beginning of a crisis with Turkey, and Turkey would be next in this, and Turkey would be accused of, supporting Hamas or, Muslim Brotherhood movements elsewhere. So that was one of the interpretations, and in a way Turkey reacted to that and wanted to take its position early on this crisis, and therefore decided to side with Qatar. And another explanation, of course these are not mutually exclusive, is financial and economic interests of Turkey with Qatar, which was developing rapidly when the Qatar crisis developed. And finally, we can argue that Turkey sort of thought that this crisis, Qatar crisis, could be potentially harmful consequences, could have potentially harmful consequences regarding Turkey's calculations and involvements in Iraq and Syria. And that's why Turkey took a clear position here in the Qatar crisis. But whatever the reasons, I mean, this Turkey's position, the splits in the GCC, and especially the Qatar crisis, and then Turkey's position vis-à-vis this crisis, created an important rift, I would say, in the relationship. And the GCC clearly began to be divided on Turkey policy. How to understand Turkey, how to see Turkey's role in the region. Of course, I have to say that throughout, even in the period of rapprochement, there was always this question mark in the GCC countries. I mean, what is Turkey after? Why Turkey wants to be involved in the Middle East? And they always had this long-term concerns about Turkey's regional ambitions, and with the in the last 2 years, these concerns intensified in a way. I mean, I always, even in the time of rapprochement, whenever I visited the Gulf countries, I always felt this ambiguous attitude. I mean, on the one hand, wanting Turkey to be involved in the Middle East. On the other hand, be concerned about Turkey's involvement, this kind of ambiguity, and it became clear in the last 2 years. The second factor, I think, has been the change in the US administration. I mean, with the Obama administration, the Gulf countries had their concerns. They were concerned about Obama's policy of engaging Iran and signing a nuclear deal. They were concerned about Obama's disengagement, quote unquote, from the region. They were concerned about Obama's Syria policy, etc. So they were more, they were less inclined to a deterioration of relations with Turkey. Turkey was much more important at that point. But with Trump, that changed dramatically. Although, Trump's policy has its own contradictions, and it's not clear, what Trump administration, and they had some problems with Qatar crisis also, but still, at least Iran policy is in favor of the GCC view, and, the relations are developing. And so I think that has been an important factor. Another factor is about Turkey. Specifically, and specifically Turkey's Syria policy, which led to a further divergence. Turkey has been a crucial ally of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in Syria, and this was one of the reasons, as I said, to manage relations between the GCC and Turkey after the Arab uprisings. But that started to change, and because Turkey's interest in Syria began to shift from toppling Saddam to dealing with the Kurdish issue. This, in fact, started even in 2012 when Syrian forces withdrew from Kurdish areas, Kurdish majority areas, and allowing forces aligned with the PKK to be influential in that region, but especially when the US-led coalition, especially US itself, began to ally itself with the YPG in northern Syria and expand the influence of YPG in even non-Kurdish areas in the north, this was alarming for Turkey, and Turkey started to focus on this issue, and basically that created again a divergence in the GCC-Turkey relations, because for the GCC countries, the main aim was still toppling of Saddam, whereas Turkey started to cooperate with Russia, to achieve its own objectives, and that created an important divergence. As I said, in the past, in the ambiguous period, it was a factor that was keeping them together. That also disappeared, which led to a further rift. And finally, I would say Iran issue, and that's also a very complicated issue. From the beginning, I would say, although GCC and Turkey shared some concerns about Iran, their perspectives never completely the same. I mean, where most of the GCC countries, some important ones, perceived relations with Iran as a zero-sum game, Turkey never perceived its relations with Iran as such. Turkey-Iran relations are much more complicated. I know that some GCC countries never understood that. They never understood how Turkey is critical of Iran but somehow engages Iran. But that's the history of Turkey-Iran relations. It is complicated not only due to economic relations. I mean, it is geographic, it is historical, it's political. It is a much more complicated relationship, and so therefore it was never possible for Turkey to see eye to eye with the GCC as regards to Iran. And whereas GCC's main national security concerns center on Iran. That divergence has always been there, I would say, but with the problems in relationship, it became much more pronounced. So, these are the main factors that I think led to the recent more problematic relations with the GCC, between GCC and Turkey. And a final point about Kuwait's role. Of course, Kuwait is a member of GCC and it acts within the GCC, but it recently it crafted itself a new role of a mediator, especially when Qatar lost this position in the GCC. Kuwait seems to be taken up this position. Its positions on Iran are more nuanced than, I think, than some countries. And it began to develop good relations with Turkey as well. So, maybe we can discuss this later. Kuwait could play an important role in mending fences in GCC-Turkey relations, although I have to say that there are limitations because, I talked about some structural impediments in the relationship. But they could at least go to a period where they were managing their relations after the Arab uprisings. And I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Altınşık. You set a very good ground for discussion. And now we turn to Dr. Sami Alfaraj. We'll be talking, maybe taking this point where Professor Altınşık left with Turkey-Kuwait relations and the strategic aspect, please.
This is my diaries, my strategic diaries. Normally I plot conspiracies here, but today I will present to you the complexity of the Kuwaiti-Turkish relation. My colleague has alluded to what we want in this relationship. So what do we want as Kuwait? A lot of people in Kuwait argue that Kuwaitis do not know what they want. I will just take you back to the last chapter of the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a small, Ottoman forces never really arrived at Kuwait. There were port of calls. There was a ship called Zahaf that visited the harbor of Kuwait. There were others, other nations like Dutch, Russians, English, of course, and Portuguese. So there was only one port of call by the Ottoman Navy, and then eventually by the late 90s, 1890s, Ottoman garrison was established in Warba Island. It was a cause for concern for the ruler of Kuwait. So he invited the British and he really convinced them to sign an agreement. They did not come to offer us a protection treaty. We actually, we got them into signing a protection treaty. 1961, we said we don't want you anymore, so the British. So we left Turkey in the late 19th century. We left Britain in the middle of the 20th century. And in 2017, the last few months of 2017, and the earlier months of 2018, we have already invited both Turkey and Britain to come back. So this tells you about our mindset. So don't blame us, we are like that. Okay, so what do we want? What do we want to achieve from this partnership? That's a major question for both of us, because we have to address our national security objectives, like Kuwaiti national security objectives and Turkish national security objectives. When you look at size, Kuwait lives today, the Kuwaitis or the Kuwaiti leadership or the Kuwaiti decision-making lives in a situation where they see themselves in a very changing security environment, a landscape. So what was for us a constant, that is the GCC as the rock, the bedrock of our defense, is in a fluid situation today. We cannot say it's a constant anymore. There is really a big change. A big change that, in the past, if I were to to show you, we were looking at Iran on the east and Iraq on the north, but relying on the GCC behind us. Now, some Kuwaiti planners do not think so. You know, we have to really look at the three dimensions of this relationship, and it is something due to, in my view, my personal view, not necessarily the view of the Kuwaiti leadership, is that, you know, there are some forces within the GCC that see themselves that having won against the Arab, you know, the Arab Spring, having won by, you know, by using whatever means they had in order to really diffuse the Arab Spring movements, you know, the demonstrations in the street. And now we see like an axis within the GCC. It's a different thing. We used to be 6 nations looking at our own common defense, but then now we see that there is an axis developing within the GCC. I'll draw your attention to, after the conclusion of the GCC summit in Kuwait, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia announced the formation of a commission. This commission is in charge of, you know, synchronizing both policies of the two nations' policies in the field of security, grand strategy actually, then security, then economy, and of course politics, and what they do about the rest of the Arab world. This axis, in our view, we could be wrong, you know, about that, but in our view, until now, we see that this axis sees for itself a mission of really interfering in other Gulf, in other Arab states by using the means available to them. But they forget that, you know, if we talk about the means, and mainly it's financial means, then smaller Kuwait, smaller Qatar, and smaller Kuwait put together, they have a sovereign wealth more than Norway, which is #1 in sovereign wealth. So there is this image we have, or there is this sense that you cannot belittle us. We are still, you know, small and strong, and we have, besides the financial means, we have the location. We have, in strategy, you have to flip the coin. So if it's you know, it's a position of weakness, like Kuwaiti location. Kuwait is between 3 major Gulf powers, that's Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And it has no natural barriers, you know. So if we talk about the popular mobilization there in Iraq, can just reach Kuwaiti borders? Yes, they can. Smaller asymmetric bands of whoever you call them, terrorists, you call them revolutionaries, can really wreak havoc in Kuwait. We actually engage on daily basis in our internal security, and we unearth lots of plots with regard to Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and others. After the demise of Daesh, there was a major concern in Kuwait that Daesh or ISIS will relocate to the Arabian Peninsula, and they could also be in Kuwait. And we uncovered a plot in that regard. So when we look at the Kuwaiti situation today, which is in the middle of those 3 forces, we have no natural barriers, and we are actually very close with regard to missile threat from Iran. The shortest range of Iranian missiles, which is called Al-Fatih 110, can reach Kuwait. You know, it is 300 kilometers, and we are within that circle of threat. Now we can, as we think there, this, you know, precarious location, we can actually engage larger powers who would like to be in that region, like a constant presence, like Britain. It will be a big service to perhaps Turkey and other medium-sized powers to be there in the Gulf. So this is the way we look at things. We have to flip the coin from, you know, a position of weakness to a position of strength by engaging larger powers. Now, we cannot just say to Turkey, come and get in the face of Iranian guns like we are. No, there has to be also incentives for that. First of all, whether Turkey would like to be in the Gulf itself. That's the first and most important thing. The other thing is that what have we built so far in order to get Turkey there? We already have established in the past decade or more, we are what we described in NATO as partner of NATO from outside NATO. I don't know if you can explain that to me after this conference. I will be really delighted. Second thing is that we are the first to join the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, ICI. So we are the first member. Now you have 4 members from the GCC. And we also enjoy the same status like Israel, with regard to protection treaties. There isn't a medium-sized power in the world that we have not really engaged or signed an agreement. We have signed with NATO. We have signed with members of NATO that are not the first layer, like Poland, for instance. Then there is people outside NATO, like Ukraine. So name them, you will find them in the streets of Kuwait, driving jeeps and forces all over the place. The other day I saw in front of me Danish military police. I said, wow, Danish military police, what are they doing on the beaches of Kuwait? And so what our policy today is basically to expand the circle of allies, and we trade interests. So there is important thing that, there is economic development for us is quite an important thing. And the other thing that really engages us with Turkey is that we both have this grand strategic objective, and that is to really be ready for the new the 21st century, the new international system. 69 nations, including us, have signed with China for the new Silk Road and Belt. So we want to get there, and I'll show you in the maps what I mean. Here, this is the old Silk Road, if you can see it. And you can see it's coming and getting from China. It is the maritime Silk Road. And it enters the Gulf, and it goes to Basra, which is next to us, and then goes across Iraq and across Syria to Turkey, and from Turkey to Europe. So it is an important thing for us to basically get on the Silk Road. Why? Because we think that there is no solution to what has afflicted the Middle East, like sectarianism, like I am a Sunni or you are a Shiite or whatever, you are an Armenian, you are a Kurd. You cannot really solve all these issues until you really solve the issue of development for all. If we are developed, let's just start, then we will not be talking. I will not be talking about who you are, what religion you have, what sect you belong to. I need to talk with you on the basis of interest. And that's what we want from the individual level to the state level, that we all talk. I talk to Turkey, like Kuwait talks to Turkey, on this level, the level of interest, not the level that Turkey is another Muslim nation or Turkey is next to me. Neighborhood is very important, and we look at the larger neighborhood in the Middle East, but we also have, my colleague has alluded to the fact that we have crafted for us, this mediator role, but we are mediators almost over the world, all over the world. We go into places, and our engagement with the world is on humanitarian level. So the assets really invested by Kuwait in the humanitarian level is so vast, and we are almost everywhere. I mean, you need to fly just on Kuwait Airways because they start the flight with this movie. This is where we are, and this is exactly where we are, and you'll see so our role in the world is a much larger role than really engaging people on just security, on war, on fighting terrorism, fighting ISIS, although these are threats to us and threats to Turkey. Like ISIS, the unity of Turkey is an important thing for us. If we see a dwindling role for us in the GCC with the rise of this axis between Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and we do not want to be part of that axis. And then we look at another role. So we live with almost continuous concern about two things, about our immediate security. The other thing is our influence in the world. You know, the clout, strategic clout, which is very important. Okay, what are the strengths and weaknesses? And I will go into detail in order just for the sake of time and brevity. Kuwait, here on the left, you will see in my lovely agenda there is, has got presence, different types of presence. And Turkey on the right, you will see different types of presence. Already, Turkey is in the Red Sea in Mogadishu. Already, Turkey has announced it's going to revamp the former Ottoman fort in Sawakin, which belongs to the Sudan. And then Turkey could be also in Djibouti. But is Turkey close to its, historic rival Iran? No, nobody can give it that location except Kuwait. The question for us here as Turkey and as Kuwait is this really addressing our national? I am telling you that, the jury is still out. This is a case in progress. You see, we still are debating and analyzing and assessing, and there are, many dimensions to that. There are historic dimensions, there are strategic dimensions, there are financial, there are economic dimensions, there are, obligations on us, obligations on Turkey, and I'll go with some detail now. We need to really sit together and really assess the situation from the perspective, what are the threats that we perceive to us, and then we'll see the opportunities. This is a simple SWOT analysis, what was modified in order to look at the political and legal framework, historical, and then we will see that what we need to, what are the requirements. Now, if you talk about a treaty or a military treaty, for instance, or defense treaty, what is required to? I mean, Turkey buys for its own defense, but Turkey did not acquire things in order to move all over, the Middle East. This is an economic burden, We experienced that after the invasion of Saddam Hussein of Kuwait, that, the Syrians and Egyptians were, great military powers in Middle Eastern standards. But in order to get them to Kuwait, it's just like you calling the police station and say, oh, come here, come, please. We have this guy, coming to whatever do to us. And then the police station tell you, okay, sure, send me the driver and I'll come instantly. So this is the situation of Kuwait today. Second thing is that, if we go into this analysis, the strength that is the strategic locations. For us, Turkey is the access to Europe. This is the end for us of the Silk Road. The second thing is the economic and financial. Kuwait, you correct me later about the size of the Turkish economy, but I think it's like 3 trillion, something like that. And for Kuwait, it's a much smaller economy. But if you look at the sovereign assets, which Kuwait has got. Just to tell you how we look at the new Silk Road, Kuwait has now in its portfolio as a sovereign wealth 592 billion. We are already informed our nations that we are going to spend 450 billion in order to get from this morass of the Middle East into a different future, because we really experienced wars. People like in my age, the age of His Excellency the Ambassador, We saw so many crises and so many wars next door to us, really next door to us. And therefore, we don't want our new generation, our kids, the kids of others, the kids of the Iranians, kids of the Iraqis, the kids of Turkey, anywhere, the Israelis, the Arabs, Palestinians, we don't want them to get the same future. We want a different future. And therefore, we have to build that, the Silk Road. Second thing with regard to, we have partnerships. Turkey is part of NATO and part of different, like my colleague alluded to, this partnership with Russia with regard to the solution of the Syrian crisis. Turkey was also a partner with Turkey, with Syria before that, a partner with Iraq, still is a partner with Iraq. And then you have what we have. We have generations like you coming, inshallah, of generations and generations of financial. In Kuwait, we cannot say that we are really good managers of technology because we don't have, technology or values there, but we are very good financial managers, all right? Very good financial managers. And there is a layer of expertise that really going to benefit our partnership with regard to what do we do, like in the field of Islamic banking, for instance, which is a major thing, and so on and so forth. What do we do from, can we move from whatever we have today into the manufacturing thing, like Turkey? Can we follow the model of Turkey? Can we really, I know that there is an engagement in 2 days on Friday of, graduating engineers here in Turkey. It's a joint venture between Kuwait and Turkey. And now our international airport is going to be built by a Turkish consortium, and so on and so forth. Also, we have, the Turkish soap opera, which never ends and goes on and on and on. We are going on and on and on. And all the barbers in the GCC are Turks now, and it's like a trendy thing there. And the managerial skills we have as two nations are going to really, really beneficial to the betterment of this alliance. What are the weaknesses? One weakness is when you look at the map, you'll see Qatar is there and Kuwait is there, and this is Turkey. How are we going to bridge this? This is really a big thing. What shall we buy? We buy those space shuttles to get to the. But I think you will see with the passage of time that there are solutions to that, and I do not really. I think it's very soon that you will see Turkish stations, all over the Gulf, because of the need for an outsider to be a balancer. That's normally small states next door to larger scales always look for a balancer. So we have this discourse in the Arab media, why are you getting those Christian powers like America? Why don't you use this or that? Smaller nations actually do not call their cousins. They call people differently. And this is how the world is run. Nobody actually trusts except, common interest. And there isn't any other nation in the Gulf that understands this lesson more than Kuwait. Witness the 1990, who stood with us and who stood against us. So we have, since we really matured, and based on this maturity, we say that Turkey is a good partner. It's not like we are running, looking for any partner. No, because not necessarily because of defense purposes, because we have the Brits, people say that, a nuclear submarine present in the Arabian Sea, just like, remember the Falkland? There was a Repulse, a submarine. That submarine shot a cruiser called the General Belgrano and really sealed the fate of the Argentinians occupying the Malvinas or the Falklands. So we need that clout. So this partnership with Turkey is not going to be something that really dragged Turkish troops into the wars of the Middle East. We'd rather not have wars in the Middle East at all. But I could define our engagement with Turkey. Turkish presence is actually Turkish or British or American now is what they call in strategy the tripwire effect. You know, you have a tripwire. So if you cross that tripwire, you engage Turkey, you engage Britain, you engage the United States. So there is a presence, some sort of presence in order to deter. Because for Kuwait, we learned from 1990 that our emphasis should be on deterrence, not on defense. Defense, whatever we engage with any person in the world is not going to be beneficial. We have to deter that person. I have just perhaps one slide or two. What is our threat assessment? For the threat assessment upon which you really say, okay, let's go and have an alliance with Turkey, or let's call the Britons back into Kuwait, is based on what you feel or perceive as a threat to you. So for us, when you talk about like terrorism for Kuwait, like, you know, if you kill one, like this incident that happened in the airport, Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, if this happened in Kuwait, this is a national disaster. Seriously, a national disaster. If you take the size of Kuwaiti population compared to the Turkish population, it's just like when we had prisoners of war or detainees in Iraq. It was, you know, if we compare that, we used to explain to the Americans that this is like the size of 250 for America, 250,000, you know, POWs in Iraq. That is the size compared to, with regard to Kuwaiti population. So there is, for Turkey, you know, Turkey, this important unity of the Turkish state. And for us, it is very important for us. Turkey is very important, and therefore, we really are, we see eye to eye with regard to the impact of terrorism, splinter movements, whatever. Now there is also a greater threat. Now when you talk about the whole Syrian morass is based on where gas is and where oil is. Now if we say like, all right, let's push the Kurds from northern Syria, we are going to end up with, you know, gas reserves until 2022. So there isn't much. Most of the gas is basically in the sea, and Syria could be in one day, you know, in the future. There is peace. Syria will be the third after Russia and Iran. It will replace Qatar. All right. So this tells you, this gives you a perspective about that war. But for us, we need that corridor in order to cross to Turkey, and I will show you now in the. I'll show you on the map now. Similarity of security threats, yes, we have. We see like those asymmetric threat. Turkey sees the same thing, but now we have another threat, which is if we think that if we say that our grand strategy is basically to join this Silk Road, Silk and Belt. Is the West going to accept that? Or will it stop at Turkey's borders, Turkish-European borders? That's what we fear. Because I told you about the amount of investment we put. I talked about the financial investment. I did not talk about how many generations are going to put into, you know, now in schools in order to train them for the future. How many in Turkey are going to be trained for this future linkage? So we have to really settle this issue and think together. Now, the opportunities for us is cooperation in security. That's what we talk about here. Another thing is cooperation in development. Now, when we have Turkish partners in development of Kuwait airport, I mean strategic things like transportation, like railways, like water, like airports. This is cooperation development. The second thing is that we cooperate with other nations who do not have the financial means, and Turkey understands them more than us, and we have the financial assets. So if we talk together, like we give assistance to like Kyrgyzstan and other nations in that belt, you know, around, and Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth. We want to develop for these nations, 69 nations, we are partnering with some of them. But the greatest partner for Kuwait, we were the first in 69 nations who signed this agreement with China in June 2014. So we were the first. What do we want the Chinese? The Chinese will build something we call the Silk City. The Silk City is for us is the terminal to the future. We cross into Iraq, we cross into Iran, we cross, and then if we cross through Iraq, we'll cross to Turkey. And then from Turkey, we go to Europe. And that's what we want to get to. We do not want to rely on oil. We want to rely on trade, and we want to rely on brains. And so this is a security concern for us, because we are one commodity economy, and that is an important security aspect in the economic sphere. Now I'll show what these are the modalities which I have already. So do we want a base like in Mogadishu? That is one venue for cooperation. There is another base, and maybe you don't need to rebuild this base. Maybe you will build another base in the Gulf. But that is not our main. Our main is, you see the ones in brown here? This is where there is a cut. It is inside where Syria. So if we manage to cross here from Kuwait through Iraq, we have very good relationship with the governments of Iraq now. So if we build railways and we reach northern Syria, now there is a problem here with northern Syria, a problem for Turkey. So can we cross into Syria itself? So this is the problem for us. This thing in brown. That is more, it is our future security thing, okay? It is. The last thing is that this is what Turkey has done already with these nations, and this is a model we want to pursue, okay? This is what we want to pursue, something like that, but we are not really interested in this. These are, like bases, maybe, as I said to you, a tripwire effect, that you will have presence, Turkish presence, just like British presence, American presence, and Turkey as a NATO presence, like Polish presence, Danish presence. So it is not that thing that really occupy our mind. This is what Kuwait is going to do. As you can see, there is oil and oil and oil. And the joke in Kuwait is do not dig deep. You will not get water, you will get oil. When we were children, we used to say, do not dig, please. We'll get that, and then the government will take our home. They want it, of course. So in Kuwait, and the thing about, what our leadership is interested in changing these islands. A lot of people say, let's go, and this is the island where Turkish troops in the late 19th century were. Okay, Warba. Now we want to change this Warba and this, which are really closing the seafront for Iraq. They were the cause of the war of 1990. We want to make these as the terminal to engage the Iraqis and engage the Iranians. So no need to invade us. You are welcome to come and partner with us. We are partners in business, not partners in war, engage in war. We have enough wars, right? And we do not have the population to go to wars. We are not really large Egypt or large Turkey or large whoever. No, we are a very small nation. Kuwait is out of the Kuwaiti population, which is 3.5, are 1.5 almost, 1.5. So we suffer from a different security problem that is really only pertinent to small GCC nations, that we are a smaller portion of our national population. Now, if we we want to make all of these islands not touristic, not for sunbathing, and for drinking. These islands are going to be, the museums of the world. Already, if you are at Kuwait airport, I noticed 2 days ago, you will get a new guide into Kuwait. It's called the Cultural Tourism in Kuwait. Now we have the biggest cultural center, and it is for the world. And here, people do not know. A lot of people want us to build, a beach, whatever. But there are certain facts about Kuwait culture now, that, this island is called Failaka, and everybody wants. This is the base for Alexander the Great. So we have actually property we own from 3 centuries over Alexander the Great, and everybody talks to me. I say I am descendant of Alexander the Great. I'm not from Arab tribes. I may call my son Alexander. So, but here we also discovered Christian artifacts there, because we discovered that Christians moved from Palestine into Iraq, Mesopotamia. Then took a boat and said, let's travel, spread Christianity. And the current took them to Failaka Island, Ikaros in Greek, Ikaros on Alexander's books. So Failaka is a treasure, a Christian treasure. What we want is to engage the world in such, international cultural treasures. Not to imagine this for us is until now is full of missiles, Patriot missiles, in order to shoot down anything coming from Iran. We do not want to, exchange missiles with the Iranians. We want them to come and, see the artifacts, the archaeology here. We want them to trade with us. And that's this is our security concern. Our security concern is basically to flip the coin again. Flip the coin means what? Means that we really make people's perspective completely different. And I hope I have succeeded in that today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you very much. This was really interesting in many aspects and gave us a lot of food for thought. Now I will be talking about the economic aspect of the relations, and I will try to keep my presentation as short as possible to leave enough time for our speaker after me and for questions and answers. So my major argument in my presentation regarding the yok bu değil. Yanlış oldu. Regarding the and that is yours, yes. Political economy of Turkish GCC relations is actually to underline that it is politics that drives economics in this relationship. Generally, in looking at Turkey's relations with the Arab economies, in the economic sense, we see that the relations are always subject to good political relations. Whenever there are good political relations, economy boosts. But when there are, strains in the relations, conflict in the political relations, economic relations also soar. And this is, exactly opposite of what is happening with Turkey's relations with Israel. Although Turkish-Israeli relations are politically deteriorating, we see that in the last year, economic relations increased by 14%. But for relations with the Arab world in general, even at the, rather stable times, if there are no political incentives to carry the political relations forward, economic relations remain very limited. And this is what is also happening in Turkish GCC relations in general, and economic relations, are subject to good political relations. Going to Jeddah in July 2017, President Erdogan himself was saying, I'm quoting, "Political problems are temporary, whereas economic ties are permanent. And I expect the investors from Gulf countries to choose long-term ties." Well, this is actually the crux of the issue at the moment in Turkish GCC relations economic aspect, that political problems are actually affecting the relations in a deep way. Well, when, of course, we look at Turkey's relations with GCC countries, economic relations in the past decade or so. When we look at newspapers, analysts, what is written, we see these words. We're talking about a win-win dynamic, boosting relations, booming relations. Everyone is, going to win, benefit, wealth is going to be spread to the region. But considering that political relations are actually at the forefront of economic issues, we see that this is a very sensitive area between the two parties in general. So at a time when Turkey's relations, economic relations with other Arab countries, like Syria, was soaring, at a time when Turkey's relations with the EU was soaring, there was a lot of expectations on the Turkish side from relations with the Gulf. And GCC was important, especially in 4 areas. The first one was about the energy security. We know that the relations are especially good when it comes to the energy sector and a little bit over-dependent to the energy sector. We see that it was important as a source of investment capital with FDI, being very important, although I'm going to show that the amount of FDI between the two parties are very, very small, actually very minuscule. We see that for Ankara, GCC relations in economic sense are important because of the financial sector and especially in the Islamic banking sector. And we see that for construction sector, the region is an asset. So when we look at the trade volume, we see that in the last 10 years, the relations have tripled in a way. From 4.8 billion dollars, we see that the trade volume between the two parties have jumped to something around $16 billion, more than tripling. Turkey argues that the aim is to reach $100 billion by 2023. Considering that Turkey's overall trade volume is around $342 billion, Turkey aims at fulfilling almost 1/3 of its trade volume in relations with the GCC region, which is of course a novelty. It's interesting that there are many institutions in driving Turkey's economic relations with the GCC. This is something that was in general missing with other Arab countries in Turkey's economic relations. We see that there are 4 important institutional mechanisms which regulate Turkey's relations with GCC countries in the economic sense. The first one is, the non-governmental business councils between Turkey's Foreign Economic Relations Board, DEIK, and the GCC business associations, which are, the engine of the motor of the relations. We see that there are one-off, state-specific, sector-specific committees, such as, the 2012 Abu Dhabi Taka Turkey Committee for Joint Energy Investments. We see, of course, the turning point in the economic relations coming with Turkey-GCC high-level strategic dialogue, which was signed in 2008 and then turned into a joint action plan in 2010, which has been very important. And of course, we have specialized subcommittees where both parties are committed to cooperate in agriculture and food security, electricity and water, energy, environment, financial and monetary issues, health, investment, tourism, and trade. And I will try to talk about some of these issues in more details. Well, looking from the GCC side, it seems that Turkey is especially important for the energy sector. We see that for Saudi Arabia, Turkey's oil, 10% of Turkey's oil comes from Saudi Arabia, while 25% of Turkey's natural gas comes from Qatar. So while energy dominates GCC's relations with Turkey, construction sector especially dominates Turkey's relations towards the GCC. We see that Turkey's firms, like Limak, for example, is building new terminals in Kuveyt and Bahrain airports. We see that there is a great investment in World Cup 2022 in Qatar, and for Dubai's Expo 2020, Turkish firms are working very hard in the construction sector. And also looking at all these boom in Turkey's construction sector. One might wonder who's buying all these houses which are being built in Turkey. You know, looking around, there is such a huge boost in the Turkish real estate sector. It's interesting that there has actually been a boost in GCC citizens buying real estate in Turkey. The Saudis are second and the Kuwaitis are third in houses sold to foreigners. The Iraqis are, of course, still the first. But since Turkey changed its property law in 2012, we see that GCC citizens have been buying over one-fourth of all properties sold to foreigners. Of course, the most popular destination is Istanbul, then comes Antalya, then Bursa. But this is a great, impetus, so to say, to Turkey's real estate boom in general. We know that in the first half of 2017, Saudis bought over 6,000 houses, Kuwaitis bought over 4,700 houses, and another 4,000 is sold to GCC citizens, which is pretty important in this context. Of course, Turkey is seeing the GCC as an important source of investment for itself. Sorry, I should have, yeah. So looking at, let's first look at the foreign direct investment in Turkey from GCC countries, and I didn't include Oman here because it was actually negligible. So what I wanted to show is that in 2003, there was almost, zero foreign direct investment from GCC countries in Turkey, in million US dollars. And the numbers have increased tremendously during this period, right? We see that GCC total million US dollar investment in Turkey has increased from zero in 2003 to 6 billion US dollars in 2016. $445 million in 2016. What I wanted to show here is by including the world totals in general, how small the foreign direct investment of GCC countries is in Turkey. So we are talking, about this investment, banking, finance, equity shares. But when we look at the numbers or the general share of GCC in terms of investment in Turkey, we see that it is really a very small number. So looking at how Turkey is doing in GCC countries, we again see that the numbers are not very bright. We have seen a peak in 2015 with 99 million US dollars investment, which has, turned lower in 2016. And looking at the world totals, the numbers are again very minuscule. So although we can talk about the numbers increasing from zero to something, still, I think the numbers are in general very exaggerated, and there is a lot of room to fulfill in this relationship. But as long as, there are structural issues, of course, the problems are still holding there. So we see in this context that the largest foreign direct investment to Turkey comes from Qatar. But the numbers, have increased recently. Before, we had, especially in 2012, pretty high numbers coming from Bahrain, from Kuwait, and from Saudi Arabia. And Emirates have also been very important. And there is a change, in 2016. And this, of course, has something to do with the political crisis that has been taking place. Many argue that Qatar has been trying to make up for the losses that Turkey is suffering from in its foreign direct investment from decreasing Saudi and other countries, and is trying to make up the difference. But many argue that the difference is actually too big to be made up by Qatar. So this is something that maybe we should also keep in mind. So the foreign direct investment in general to Turkey has peaked in 2012, but we see that it is actually going down in general. So in order to, make up for the losses, as I said, Qatar has been putting more investment. The Saudi-Turkey trade, which has peaked in 2012, and investments in 2012, has declined by 38% in 2016. With the United Arab Emirates as well, trade has peaked in 2012. But we see that the numbers have declined by 23% in 2016. So we see that there is this impact of the political environment in general in shaping trade relations. So when we look at the number of companies, I try to look at the number of companies rather than the billions in the picture. We see that in 2017, the most numerous number of GCC companies, among GCC companies, is from Saudi Arabia. We see it followed by United Arab Emirates. Then we see around 291 companies operating in Turkey from Kuwait. I don't know if these numbers are meeting your numbers, but these are from the Central Bank and Turkish Statistic Institute. And Qatar is, only almost 1/10 of the number of Saudi firms operating in Turkey. Bahrain is 63 companies, and Oman has 21 companies operating in Turkey, and in total less than 2,000 firms, which is again very small when compared with the general picture. So as we said, many people argue that there is an important market in Turkey for GCC companies, especially in the Islamic banking sector. This Islamic banking sector constitutes one of the areas where we see GCC countries especially interested in entering. We see that, Kuwait Turk constitutes 37% of all Islamic banking market in Turkey. We see Al Baraka Turk and Türkiye Finans following this picture. So when we look at the Islamic banking sector, we see that the GCC companies are over-dominating in this context, which is leaving us, the idea that there is a lot to invest in this context, and especially the GCC countries are interested in the Islamic banking market when it comes to investment opportunities. So, looking at the general picture, okay, I'm not going to talk very long. My main argument is that all this investments, trade that we are talking about as boosting, booming, win-win situation, when we look at the numbers, does not really keep its substantial talk. We seem to be talking a lot about the boom and the boost in the economic relations, but looking at the general picture, in both parties, the shares are very, very small. So what can be done? There are, of course, a couple of things maybe which can be done, and this is something which is especially related with GCC economies in the economic sector, especially the privatization, which is, at the focus of the GCC economies. The Turkish firms are looking at, new opportunities in terms of participating to the private sector in these countries. So when there is privatization and the private sector reform, Turkish companies are looking very, closely into playing a leadership role in the growing opportunities in the GCC countries. And political risk, which I have been talking about, can often be mitigated when local firms or Turkish firms or the firms on both sides have local branches, and when they have local access. So only through encouraging two parties firms to have local branches, to invest more into the local environment and sectors, we can underline that the political risk can be erased. Other than that, and this is, a model that Turkey can replicate with the Vestel experience in Syria. There were many firms, even at the peak of the relations, that was trading with Syria, but the major issue was the weakness in terms of building local branches. When Vestel built local branches, its own branch in Syria, then its position in the market has advanced greatly. So in case, Turkey could play a role in the private sector, and if it can have local branches and access, there can be a boom in the relations. But of course, the most critical issue, again, in this context, is the free trade agreement that Turkey should sign and can sign with the GCC countries. There was the expectation that the free trade agreement with GCC would be ready by 2017, beginning of 2018. But due to political crises, this is not coming. Looking again at Turkey's economic relations with other Arab countries, we see that only after free trade agreements, the volumes have peaked. So one important turning point in boosting, or really talking about a boom and boost in the relations, economic relations, can be the signing of this free trade agreement. Short of these three issues, we see that we will only be talking about minuscule figures and talking about a potential to be reaped without much going on in this picture. There is, of course, this huge area which provides a lot of opportunity, and this is about the tourism sector. One sector which has been immune, to the political crises has been the tourism sector, and the number of tourists coming from GCC countries has been increasing tremendously in the previous years. Of course, these soap operas and Turkey's soft power in general seems to play an important role. But many were arguing that they were feeling at home coming from the GCC, and especially Trabzon has been one of the most important attractions for the GCC tourists. We see that 8 cities in Saudi Arabia has launched direct flights to Trabzon. We see United Arab Emirates and Kuveyt also offer direct flights to Trabzon, and Uzungöl has been a tourist attraction for GCC citizens, and it is really interesting in this context. And for the regional economy, Gulf tourists seem to be met with open eyes. And their holidaying is worth around 1.5 billion US dollars and is contributing to the local economy. When we look at what the tour operators are saying, they say that they always prefer the Gulf visitors. They say that Gulf visitors, because they travel in groups of extended families, because they always look for packages that include airport transport, accommodation, and local tours, they always spend more. Maybe it's not because they're perceived to be wealthy or that there is oil everywhere in most of the GCC countries, but because they tend to buy packages. When they're arriving, they're seen as rather a lucrative group of tourists which are delivering to the Turkish economy. So in this people-to-people levels transfers and contact, we see that there is immense room in investment, in the committees and the meetings. There is immense room to increase the economic ties, but still I think this room is larger than both parties would want to see. So I will stop here. So thank you. Now we're shifting to the presentation on Palestine to Dr. Shafiq, please.
Good afternoon. I know you are tired. I'm lucky most of you are still here, so you have very good students, disciplines. So you are lucky. I thought there'll be maybe 10 by the time I start. Do you need to stand up, walk in your place, do something? Is your foot numb, your back hurting? Anybody? Or you're all very young and you don't feel these issues. So
Exactly.
happy to be here at this, yes, anybody can do that. Yes. It's great to be here at the university, and for me to really explain Jerusalem and the story there, I felt I need to go into a deeper narrative. In the time I have, tried to put together a whole range of issues that relate to Palestine that makes us understand what really is happening and going on in the context of Jerusalem. So I would really start with 1917, with the Balfour Declaration of a British foreign minister who, through his declaration, announced that So announced that Palestine will become a national home for the Jewish people. So to Palestinians, this came out of the blue. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, part of an area extending from Palestine to Turkey, all one unit. And it was World War I. So everything begins there. It doesn't mean things were not there before. No, we can go back to the 19th century, but a lot starts with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the dismemberment of the Arab world into bits and pieces, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and Palestine on its size, 29,000 square kilometers, then Syria, then Lebanon, then Jordan, and the story begins there. Then in Palestine, which is, as I said, about 29,000 square kilometers, there were about 60,000 Jews. And there were 650,000 Palestinian Arabs. They were the inhabitants of the land. The Jews, I would say, half of them, if not more, were immigrants that came during the last 15 to 20 years within a certain vision of Zionism. Now, what was the story with Zionism? Well, Zionism was an invention, a European issue. A group of Jewish thinkers, Herzl among them and others, felt that to solve the Jewish European problem and the Jewish problem, there must be a state somewhere, a homeland. And it is in that context that the Balfour Declaration later on was given, among other promises here and there. And there was a Zionist movement hoping to gain a foothold in a place, and Palestine was chosen. Palestinians were not lucky, and the Arabs were not lucky with this particular choice because it came in a context of a colonial expansion worldwide. And the British victory and the French victory in World War I. So that takes us to the crux of the matter, which is how Palestine became an object of Jewish immigration, land sales, etc. And the Palestinians had to find themselves in a collective situation of resisting that process. They were in the way, and they had to resist. And that's the story of the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. So what I wanted you to see is this photo has in it the mayor of Jerusalem, who is a Palestinian Arab, in 1928, when most of Palestine was Arab. It was an Arab country like Syria, like any other. And next to him, this older man with a beard, next to him, he used to be a very prominent official in the Ottoman Empire. He's a Palestinian from Jerusalem. His name is Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, and he happened to be the first leader of the Palestinian nationalist movement resisting Zionism in Palestine. So just to give you, this is a photo of 2028, 29. Look at this photo. That's Palestine, Arab Palestine, in the early 30s when Kulthum came to sing in Jerusalem. Look at this, singers in Palestine in the, this is actually the Arab-Palestinian broadcast in the 1940s. This is a Palestinian family in West Jerusalem. All of these people will become refugees in few years down the line. Look at this, a singer. So there was an entire flourishing culture, Arab-Palestinian culture of everything. This is Haifa, predominantly Arab, in the 1920s, 27, when it was first lit in electricity, when electricity started. That's the city of Haifa. That's a group of Palestinians in actually the 1927. They were Oxford, Cambridge Palestinian students who took this photo. They never understood that few years later, they will all become refugees. This is the group of Palestinians who were studying at the American University of Beirut in 1929. This is a rally and a gathering by Palestinians in 1922, just a few years after the Balfour Declaration, few years after Britain conquered Palestine and put it part of the British mandate. They were rallying here against any attempt at land sales and Jewish immigration, trying to protect what exists of their rights and homeland. These are Arab neighborhoods as you go in Haifa and Palestine. These are the cities. This is the villager from one of the villages in Palestine just before the 1948 Nakba. I wanted to share this with you. The photo on the left side is the one that, as a result of Jewish immigration and all of the issues under the British, Palestinians made many revolutions. There was particularly the 1936-39 rebellion. But by this time, with Jewish immigration, there were about 600,000 Jews in Palestine who were militarily well organized and committed to establish a state. World War II has ended, and in 1947, Palestinians were about 1.4 million Palestinians, Muslims and Christians, and the UN, in a committee, 3 months, not more, came up with a solution that was not a solution to partition Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. So for the Jews, the Zionists, they accepted. And their acceptance is that they really owned not much of the land. They had 6% ownership of Palestine by 1947 and 48. And Palestinians were the rightful owner of the country. So it was very hard for Palestinians to sell or to accept. And that's the partition plan. Yet, there will be a war, and at the end of the war, the Israelis will take 77% of Palestine and will leave, because of military realities, the West Bank will become part of Jordan, and Gaza, as you see it in yellow on the right side. So that's what will happen in the Nakba. Attacks on Palestinians, 60,000, 66,000 strong Haganah, organized Zionist groups. Before the state was established in mid-May 48. The attacks began in early April 1948 during British mandate, and the Palestinians were not able, they didn't have arms, they didn't have much, and as a result, the more organized military force, well facilitated through British colonialism, was able to drive the Palestinians in a case of ethnic cleansing throughout the war of 1948. And that's the people running into the sea, moving. Look at this view of this group. They don't know where they're going. They're just shipped. They're just put in a car, taken somewhere. They don't know. They have no clarity. Look at the eyes, no future, nothing. It will all end up in refugee camps like this, for the majority of Palestinians spread into Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Gaza, the West Bank, all over the place. And this is a Haganah fighter, a woman fighter from the Haganah overseeing the city of Safad, a Palestinian Arab city. And I really wonder what she was thinking about. The city below her is fully empty. no Palestinians are there. They were driven out through the ethnic cleansing. And she is thinking, I don't know about what, but maybe a feeling of victory and maybe a feeling of what's next after that. So that's how that complicated conflict evolved. These are the books confiscated from Palestinian homes in Jerusalem, particularly. I mean, some of these books go back to Islamic and some pre-Islamic times. Whatever, these amazing manuscripts in many of the families of Jerusalem, they were put in the Hebrew University. They are still in the Hebrew University. So what I would like to say here is that by the end of the 1948 war, what was the situation? You have about 800 to 900,000 Palestinians become refugees. You've had West Jerusalem, which was predominantly Arab, conquered, and they were ethnically cleansed. They were forced to leave. But the more important one is that nobody that was forced to leave was allowed to come back. And that was part of the project. I mean, refugees leave. Refugees go for safety. South Lebanon, during all the wars, people would leave in whole groups and then come back once there is a ceasefire. The Palestinians were among few in modern history that were not allowed back after all of this. But after the 1948 war, the Israelis destroyed 400 plus villages of Palestinians who were in the places where Israel was established. Totally destroyed, totally erased. And on top of these villages, either parks or settlements. So the settlement issue is a historical issue in the entire Zionist Israeli project. Now, here I want you to see this. You see, in those areas where the 400 plus, about 420 villages existed in main Palestine, where Israel now is, there is always cactus that comes out. That's where the villages were. It was the way the villagers used to mark their particular village against, it was the border, it was against any other animals crossing, danger, whatever it is. So whenever these parks were built or whenever these villages were erased, cactus is the place where the crime was committed. You will find the villages. You go through the whole Israeli territory and you will see lots of cactus, big concentrations. You will know you're in an area which used to have a village that's maybe 1,000 years old, 1,500 years old, 600 years old, that was erased in 1948, 49, particularly 49 after the end of the first Arab-Israeli war. Cactus, you look here, it's wood, but you go in, you see the cactus, you go look more, you're going to see the rocks and the remnants of the destroyed and erased houses. You're going to see the well of the town. You're going to see a lot of stuff. This is in Tiberias. Now, my family used to be in Palestine before it ended up in Kuwait. I am a proud Kuwaiti citizen. But my family, that's my grandfather's house in Palestine. It was in Tiberias. They were forced out. And this property, like all the property of family I have on both sides, Haifa and Tiberias, was confiscated through a land, they called it absentee laws. Absentee land laws. They came in a series in 1951, 52, 53, 54, confiscated all the property. So this is a house, confiscated, then it became the house of the chief Israeli police in Tiberias. And now it is vacant, but it is part of the Ministry of Interior in Tiberias, in Israel. So this is the story of, so in a way, once Israel was established, they confiscated all the homes, the houses, the shops, everything, the businesses, whatever people own at large. It's a huge theft, but then legalized by Israeli laws. Some Israelis do recognize that, but the majority, so far, do not. That's the house itself, my grandfather's house. That's where my father worked in Haifa. Now it's a building. It used to be the oil company. He was a doctor in Haifa before forced to leave, he and his family. This is here a Palestinian. See, I said they destroyed more than 420 villages, but they kept very few. Maybe this is one that was kept after 1948. Why did they keep it? Well, it's a showcase. They gave it, it's called Ain Hod. It's next to Haifa. If anyone of you ever goes there, go look for Ain Hod. They've changed the name, they made it Ain Hod. So it sounds Israeli. It's Ain Hod. And what happens to Ain Hod? They turned it into a place for Israeli artists to show their art and sell their art on certain days on the week. You go there, you walk, you discover that they've kept that village just for a very strange reason. And but what happened to the people of Ain Hod? They were all kicked out, they were all forced out, none of them stayed. Few stayed in what became Israel. As you all know, maybe, few Palestinians stayed in what became Israel. The majority became refugees. But among those few that remained, 160,000, half of them were internal refugees. They couldn't go back to their homes, even though they took refuge in a next to that village, another town, another place. So the people of Ain Hod, who became in the Israeli structure, kept demonstrating, wanting to go back. But finally, they took a piece of land next to Ain Hod and called it Ain Hod. And now they're building a settlement, a Palestinian settlement. So that movement of return, whether within or from without, continues. This is Ain Hod. This is also one confiscated house in Tiberias, which happens to be my mother's uncle. There are 13 Israeli families that live today in this house. It used to house one family. So, as this happens, you get, there were 600,000, 650,000 when Israel was established. Keep in mind that at least 400,000 of, 60,000 were in 1917, 1918, but it became 650,000 as a result of Jewish immigration regulated by the British. Between 32 and 34, 35, about 250,000 Jewish immigrants came to Palestine, and after 48, the road was open, and they came from all over the world. Eastern Europe, 250,000 immediately. The Arab world, many of the Jews of the Arab world came as a result of that. So that's the ships bringing bringing whoever, Jewish immigrants, etc. But where are you going? You're going to a land where people were kicked out and through ethnic cleansing. Where are you going to be a house? You're going to live in their houses and in their places. 1/3 of the Jewish population of Palestine was living in Palestinian Arab houses during the 1950s and early 60s. More than 1/3 of the entire country. So you get this. This is the older photo of the maps that I showed you. And here, what I wanted to say is that that's what stayed with the Arabs as a result of the 1948 war in yellow. But that in yellow in 1967 was taken. That's the West Bank on the right side in yellow, and the one down there, which is 1.5%, the one down there, Gaza of Palestine, stayed with the Arabs after 48, was conquered in 1967. In 1967, the Israelis were able to defeat the entire, Egypt, and they took Sinai, Syria, and they took the Golan Heights, Jordan, and they took from Egypt Sinai plus Gaza, and they took from Jordan whatever was of Palestine, which is the West Bank. So Israel expanded 2 to 3 times immediately after 1967. And that was a turning point. Palestinians now, they see the occupation immediate in the West Bank and Gaza. So what happens? They just wage a struggle. The struggle continues year after year from 67. 65 there was struggle in the 50s and 60s. But the real one would begin after 67. Through Fatah, later on Hamas, through all kinds of organizations, Popular Front Liberation, this entire Palestinian Fidaiyin period of the 1960s and late 60s and 70s and into the 80s went on and on. So there was an entire struggle, intifadas, rebellions in the West Bank, hoping for independence, hoping for a way to resolve the issue in a just way, hoping for the right of return, hoping for the right to property, etc. So that all became under occupation. That land in total became under occupation, and the world recognized that the West Bank and Gaza should be returned. And East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. So East Jerusalem, that other half of Jerusalem, was conquered in 1967. Thus, the story of Jerusalem begins. And what did the Israelis do after they occupied in 1967 Palestine? I mean, the Palestinians were struggling, but the Israelis were building settlements. In the beginning, few, but then more, then more, then more, then more, then hundreds of thousands came. And so it's the same process that existed before 1948, that existed during British mandate of settlements and land and trying and bringing, continued with the Israeli victory of 1967. So intifadas by Palestinians, rebellions continued. This is in Jenin. This is after a major intifada that the Jenin, it's a symbol. Jenin was destroyed, but later on the people from the destruction created this horse. So you have a situation of settlement building all over. However, there was attempts. I mean, one can tell me, well, what about the Palestinians? Did they try at least a middle of the way? I would say that 1993 and 94, because you've had so much struggle, including the 1982 war, where about 30,000 Palestinians died when Israel invaded Lebanon. This is a well-known, historical transformation of the conflict. But then, by 1993, the Palestinians were willing to look at half solutions, and that's where the Oslo Accords. That's how the Palestinian Authority emerged. That's how Arafat came to make an agreement with the Israelis. But the main Israeli that Arafat made an agreement with, who happens to be the prime minister then of Israel, Ishaq Rabin, was killed by an assassin. Still, a Zionist assassin who felt he is giving up on the land. So in a way, Rabin could not go on giving back the West Bank and coming to a solution of which other Israelis felt it contradicts their ideology of settlement and expansion. So it's in that context. You look today, settlements are all over the place. This is in the middle of Hebron. It's an Arab Muslim city, Palestinian, Hebron. These are settlers in the middle of the city. This is the main market of Hebron, and on top of it are the settlers, and there's a lot of things that are thrown on people. This is Hebron. Arabs are not allowed to walk on a Hebronite street. It's called the Martyr Street. The Israelis took it over for settlers. Arabs, Palestinians walk on the other side. Settlers walk in the middle. It's an apartheid. We are in a way, when you look today at it, it's a full-fledged apartheid. Look at this. That's the way things have evolved. Hebron, the famous historical city, has been divided in that sense, and there are about 800 or 600 settlers in the midst of an entire city that has, 70 or 80,000 people. And then a wall. The wall surrounds the entire West Bank. And that wall surrounds the entire area. Walls, walls, walls. So people live behind walls. Not only Gaza is totally encircled, but the West Bank, where 2.5 million Palestinians live, is encircled. Walls all over. It's a jail. You've pushed the other to a jail. And it's now under the Palestinian Authority. But that is how difficult it is. Walls all over, and it goes on. Settlements, settlements, settlements. And not only that, but these settlements are also in Jerusalem. So when you look at settlements throughout the West Bank, there are about 350,000 settlers. So where is the Palestinian state going to take place? I don't see that. That's killed it through Jewish settlement. Well, what about Jerusalem? East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is surrounded by more than 300,000 settlers. These are settlers that are surrounding Jerusalem. So how is that? I mean, it's in a way become internal. Palestinians have been internalized into a state of apartheid. All settlements in Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. These are the main old walls of the city of Jerusalem. And these are settlers in the city, in the small city, directly in the next, very close to the Aqsa Mosque, and to the church, and to all that. So you have Jerusalem as well penetrated. There are about 4,000 settlers inside the city walls of Jerusalem, and there are 300,000 settlers outside the walls, and there are 300,000 Arabs as well, Palestinians, around Jerusalem and in Jerusalem. So that's where the conflict is. Nothing can address this unless there is a clear disengagement, clear rights, clear civil rights, human rights, political rights, etc. That's the Aqsa Mosque, part of the Jerusalem situation. This is a church in what became Israel, at the borders of Lebanon, called Kafar Ikrit. In 1948, the Israelis destroyed that village, Kafar Ikrit, kicked out the people, but decided not to destroy the church out of fear that somebody in the New York Times or so will say Israelis are destroying churches. So they kept the church. The Palestinians of Kafar Ikrit, of which most of them stayed in what became Israel, as a result of being kicked out after the war ended from their village, they stayed coming every Sunday to the church. Now they're trying to create a settlement around the church and live. And they have that slogan. I found that slogan in that particular village, Kafar Ikrit, I will not stay as a refugee, even though they are within the parameters of what became Israel, and they're not very far away from where their village used to be. So there is a revival of village, trying to revive what is rightfully theirs. This is another group of Palestinians who go every week to commemorate their village. It's become like as you look, I mean, it's a park, but that's where their village, Mi'ar, used to exist, and they come every week, and they have picnics, and they stay there in order to keep the memory of the village. This is in Akka. Akka today is 30% Arabs. Palestinians are 20% of the Israeli state in what became Israel. Those 160,000 were put under kind of emergency laws until 66, so they had a big expansion. These 160,000 are today 1.6 million. These are what they call is the Arabs of Palestine, that is those who stayed in 1948 Palestine. But at the other hand, you have 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. You have more than 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There are 6 million Palestinians on the land. 6 million. But there are also 6 million Jews, Israeli Jews on the land. And it's apartheid. The struggle continues. So the decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is part of this historical issue of settlement and settlement building. The Israeli state today is controlled by settlers. Netanyahu is mostly on the right, and the settlers are on the right. They control the state. Very few Israelis are able to say this settlement is going to take us into more wars and more conflict and more disaster, and it's going to incorporate maybe 6 million Palestinians, and then what? Will we have, from an Israeli point of view, a Jewish state? How can they have a Jewish state with apartheid? Or while 20% of its citizens are Arabs, while the rest of the population, Palestinian, will compose another 50%. How can that be if it continues this way? There has to be a solution. But so far, the only solution the Israelis have been able to provide to us, to Arabs, to Palestinians, to the Arab world, is an apartheid, a state of apartheid. How long can a state of apartheid continue? And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So we have ample time for questions and answers.
Thank you. Thanks, Leila.
Always difficult to ask the first question. Okay, so we will collect 3 maybe. Can you introduce yourself? We'll start with you. Yes.
Welcome to. Hello again. I'm Sana from Business Department. أهلا إلى جامعة دكتور سامي. تشرفت بمعرفتكم. My question is, as we all know, Turkish TV series has banned in NBC channel recently, and you also mentioned about that the TV series was introducing Turkish culture to Arabs, and also it was improving the connection and communication between Middle East and North Africa, between Turkey also. So, what do you think about this ban? Do you think, as they claimed, it's to improve Arab movie industry, or it has another intentions about this block, Turkish TV series block? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Nihal, do you have a question? Can we take three at a time? Yeah. Anyone else, by the way, who would like to ask a question?
Okay, firstly, thank you, Professor Tur and Altın Işık, for providing us with such an opportunity. And ahlan ve merhaban büküm fi ODTU. So my question is to Professor Tur. Professor, China and Kuwait have been working closely on infrastructure, communication technologies, energy, construction, and 5 inhabited islands, especially with One Belt, One Road project, right? Does Turkey want a stronger Kuwait in such a close proximity with the new global power, China, given the fact that the AKP government in Turkey has its eyes on Middle East and trying to pursue a leadership status in the region? Thank you.
To me? I think to him, I think, because it was about Kuwait specifically, right? So we will address it together. Okay.
What's the question?
Yeah, that's
The question is, does Turkey want to have a leadership by pursuing these projects? Does Turkey want a stronger Kuwait? Does Turkey want a stronger Kuwait? Okay. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, go ahead. The mic, please.
My question is to Shafiq Hoca regarding the Palestinian issue. How do you comment on or evaluate the GCC countries' policies toward the Palestinian issues? Thank you very much.
Maybe we can have one more.
there was one in the back.
Okay, Dr. Shafiq, should we start with you? Dr. Shafiq, should we start with you? Yeah.
As you wish.
Can I ask a question?
Okay. Well, there was a question. What does?
Can I ask a question? How do you think Turkey's and GCC countries' views meet, coincide, and diverge on the Palestinian issue?
On?
The Palestinian issue.
Palestinian issue. Okay. I will maybe then start with this.
Thank you.
Though, if in context, Turkey is sees its role as a regional power, but it also is by itself of a big size, huge country. And I think that Zionism in particular does have a problem with big countries in the region. And the problem comes from the way they perceive their threat, the danger to them, when a larger country, particularly if it has an independent course of action. A Turkey controlled by NATO is okay. A Turkey under the West is okay. The Turkey of the 50s and 60s was perfect from a Zionist point of view. But a Turkey that is independent, that can make its decisions, that is an independent player, and I would add, an Iran that is an independent player, is a danger to Zionism. So we have to all shrink in size so Zionism will be happy. It becomes the biggest state in the region. This is part of the dilemmas the Syrians face today. This is part of the dilemma any country in the region that takes a fully independent course of action is going to face. Given the way Israel was established and given the way Zionism sees itself as a country of expansion and settlement building and in confrontation over Jerusalem. So it's naturally not going to go along with the Turks over Jerusalem, over the Palestinians. It will not go along with the Iranians over Jerusalem, over the Palestinians, for all kinds of reasons. It will not go along with anybody that is empowering any trend in the region that goes way beyond the small states' national borders. So there is a story there. Now, as you said, and as I believe, it's never a zero-sum game. There are always these push and pulls. That's why I understand how far the Israelis would go in supporting the Kurds. Though I believe Kurds should have rights, and etc., but there is an attempt to fragment Turkey. And one must see that before being able to delve into a deeper issue regarding a more serious one regarding Kurdish rights. So that will continue, therefore. The kind of independence, the kind of strength, the kind of economic capabilities, the kind of power projection is threatening to some, and Zionism being on the other aisle, on the other side, a state that always must be related to a superpower, a state that always must be related to the dominant superpower of the world, and a state that also needs to relate itself to that superpower in an anti-way, in an antithesis, in a negative way to the rest of the powers in the region, unless they go in its orbit. That's the challenge, I believe, with Zionism, and that's not a challenge we will face for a year or 2 or 10 or 20. It's a long-term challenge, and until the Israelis maybe one day decide that Zionism is a cause of a lot of trouble, and they need to accommodate their neighbors and the people they are living with, the Palestinians, etc., and then we look at solution. Now, how does this relate to Kuwait and Turkey? They see similar views regarding the Palestinians and their rights and regarding Jerusalem, and Kuwait has been in that context, in terms of Palestine. Right? In terms of Palestine, Kuwait and Turkey see eye to eye and are close. Kuwait has a deep-rooted commitment to the question of Palestine. It goes very deep to the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Doesn't mean there weren't episodes, there weren't certain tensions at times, but Kuwait has always been clear on that commitment. It's not only the government of Kuwait, it's society, it's the population, it's the grassroots situation. Also, Kuwait is a country that has a civil society that is very dynamic. Any country that has a dynamic civil society will overlap on the Palestine question. Any country that doesn't have a civil society, it means people are not allowed to speak, they cannot express, you will only hear what the government say. So in Kuwait, you get that dynamic. Now, you tell me GCC, I would say there are different points of views in the GCC, and there are those today who believe there is a grand solution. But from what I hope I tried to tell you today, there is no, believe in Jared Kushner and going along with the Trump administration. I am one of those who say this will not fly. This doesn't have any basis. What we see on the ground is apartheid. What we see is a problem, is a disease, is an infection. So if you want to make a solution over an infection, it's going to explode the second day. So there are no basis unless you address the foundation of the injustice that exists today on the ground.
Can I just add something with regard to Turkey and Israel? I think another perspective is to look at the newly found resources, gas and oil in the Eastern Mediterranean. You see that there is a kind of a quarrel between Turkey and Israel and Cyprus as one bloc, the Greek side. And Turkey is advocating the rights of the Turkish minority, the Turkish Cypriot Republic. And then there is the same disagreement between Turkey and Egypt. The Turkey and Egypt there is a model in the mid-18th century when Catherine the Great sent a flotilla, a big fleet. That fleet was capable of actually controlling the whole Syrian coast. So look at it in historical perspectives. They even occupied Beirut. And after 6 years, the Russians agreed to withdraw from the Syrian coast in exchange for the Crimea. So today, in my view, I mean, there is a role for Turkey, and the emphasis by two nations like Egypt and Israel not to let Turkey get some of that cake, of the gas, is again, it's the size of Turkey. They don't want Turkey to be bigger and powerful and has a greater influence in the Middle East question and the Palestinian question. That's how I look at things. With regard to your question, I did not really get it. I did not hear it. I think I am getting old, but you may, please, both of you, yes, both of you. With regard to your question, I will answer you first. Today I write like almost every day or every other day. If I am out of question with regard to criticizing what is happening in Saudi Arabia, which is, in Kuwait, as Professor Al-Ghabra said, we have a very, very free and a strong civil society, and we enjoy our freedom in Kuwait. And therefore, we are quite critical of certain things happening in the GCC. So if I go out of my way and criticize something like today, I said, to have a fashion défilé in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, you are not, treating us with shock. The shock passed the Saudi population into the Muslim sensibilities. So be careful. And when I say something like that, I am attacked by swarms, what they call electronic flies, الذباب الإلكتروني. And they just join you, and even if you want to block, you'll get, your finger will be so tense of blocking people with your mouse. So now Turkey is coming. The greatest concern, as I know, because I deal with decision-making circles, is that the greatest worry for what happened is on the mindset of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Why it was a question, addressed to us: why Turkey? Why Turkey? So why Turkey? And again, there were two visits by the Kuwaiti head of state to Turkey. The Kuwaiti head of state came from the meeting with Mr. Trump and divulged the whole secrets, the things we did not know about the crisis. He said there was a possibility of using military, and I know personally from what was happening the first few days, there was an intention to use military force against Qatar. Also, he said it was a sudden thing, meaning what we say, it's a conspiracy, a night conspiracy. You conspire at night and you divulge it the next day, which was, the Kuwaiti Emir was not consulted. Anyway, so this put us in a situation, and even if we want to express our view, there is a censorship, our view as Kuwait. So when you say that the headache of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is why Turkey, why is Turkey coming back? Why is Turkey coming to Qatar? Now to Qatar, okay, maybe they were frightened of us, but why are the Kuwaitis calling them? So let's shut down on the whole of Turkish things, including the soap operas, because, in Kuwait, for instance, or the Gulf, women are really accused by their husbands that they leave their duties, whatever, and they are watching Turkish soap operas every day. You will find that on the social media. So I am not surprised that they are blocking your soap operas. With regard to your question...
does Turkey want to empower Kuwait with its policy?
I think as Kuwait, we are not talking about crude force, crude power, because a brute force, we can never have brute force unless we really have a nuclear weapon, perhaps. But as a small state, we are so powerful in the diplomatic sense. We are so powerful in the soft power, as they call it, like in cultural power. We are so powerful with regard to peacemaking. I mean, getting into engaging. We were engaged as Sheikh Sabah, the head of state, he was engaged with the Russians in in the early 1980s after the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war. So we are always engaged. So we have a power, we have a big share of humanitarian work, and this is also a power. Now, how could Turkey empower us? I think by Turkey being what Turkey is and what Turkey is advocating in the Muslim world or for its own foreign policy with regard to the Syrian questions, we disagree with Turkey in certain things, like we do not look into what type of regime is going to control Syria later after peace. We say we leave it to the Syrian people. So when Turkey goes to Astana and goes to Sochi, we say no, it is Geneva. Why Geneva? Because in Geneva, the Syrian president's fate is already settled. So there is no discussion about him. When you discuss about him, if you go to Sochi or Astana, that's why the Americans did not go. They will be required to bargain something. If we, like in the form, if we Russians agree to removing Mr. Assad, what do you give us in return? We want some leeway in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. So the Americans do not want to go there. They want to go to Geneva. Now, as Kuwait, here is where we disagree with Turkey. We want to go to Geneva. But this is not a big question for Turkey, because Turkey could come around to this settlement. Because it can go both ways. It can go to Sochi and it can go to Geneva. Now, the empowerment of Kuwait is basically that we can work diplomatically. As I said to you, if you walk in the streets of Kuwait, and especially in the desert, we have 2/3 of the Kuwaiti size allocated to NATO. NATO can actually go into maneuvers using missiles, surface-to-surface missiles. But I think they will cross the Kuwaiti borders into the sea. There is no room, actually. But 2/3 of Kuwait are allocated to NATO. If you know that the Kuwaiti population lives over 13 to 14% of the Kuwaiti size, because Kuwait Oil Company allocated this to us to live. Otherwise, the rest is under question, as I showed you on the map. A lot of oil, plenty of oil. So therefore, there are two powers in Kuwait: Kuwait Oil Company and NATO. All right. So the empowerment with regard to military terms, I tried to stress to you in my presentation 2 points: that the question we're looking for is not necessarily the presence of a crude force, a brute force, a military force, facilities, but perhaps these facilities will be an empowerment for Turkey in the Gulf questions, in the Middle East questions. Otherwise, we have lots of people there actually running around with their weapons. Second thing is the empowerment for us is basically to engage more forcefully in the Silk Road and Belt. Personally, as a person, I wrote Kuwait Vision, which is called the New Kuwait. The New Kuwait is what I explained to you, is to develop wherever we can develop. So empowerment of Kuwait is to allow us to develop inside Turkey, with Turkey's partnership. That is empowerment for Kuwait. It's not necessarily the presence of Turkish troops on Kuwaiti side.
Okay. All right, so thank you very much. You have a comment, please? Okay, go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to say that I enjoyed your talks. All of you were amazing, actually, especially the one for Palestine, and I felt really all the emotions came to me, actually. But regarding the question that somebody is asking about, I think the embassy, or I didn't get your point when you said something related to the fashion show which was in Medina. How this is related to the answer of her question, please?
Me?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there was a fashion show.
No, I said to you that the leadership in Saudi Arabia, especially the Crown Prince and the people around him, are not for anybody criticize anything, even if it relates to us. So for me, when I talk to Medina, it's not a question of the Saudi population. It's not a Saudi city. Mostly, it's a Muslim city.
Yeah.
So when you touch on us, like Israel and East Jerusalem, the question is for the Palestinians to settle with the Israelis. Okay? Whatever. But with regard to East Jerusalem, now Israel crosses from the Palestinians, who are mainly Muslim nation, to the whole Muslim, people, 56 states. Now, when you talk about Medina, now when I talk, it's not for me to say that, the Crown Prince is levying new taxes. It's him and his
Just one point,
population.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just for the audience to know that this is like an initiative from the people themselves, and it wasn't authorized by the government itself. And the next day, the people who organized that event in Medina were punished, and now they are questioning why they are organizing this without taking authorization from the government itself.
Well, it's not a strategic issue to really discuss here, But I did that in passing by saying, in order just to crystallize my point, and which is they are averse to criticism. Although, when you talk to Medina, I have a right to talk about it, not because I am a Saudi or I am a Kuwaiti or GCC, whatever. No, because I am a Muslim. That's it. So the Holy Haramain is Haramain for us. That's it. We can do whatever fashion show wherever you like, but leave the Haramain as Haramain.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's why I'm saying that it wasn't authorized by the government.
I said I was
Yeah,
answering that
and it's
candidate.
just an initiative from the people themselves, and the government didn't issue the authorization for such an event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Okay, so please join me in thanking our speakers. This was a fantastic, 3 speakers, and this was a thank you very much. So, and I also thank the audience who are in this room for over 2.5 hours, and you made this, a success. So thank you very much, yes, to everyone. So we're closing the 5th event of the Kuwaiti cultural activities. Thank you.
There is a promise in the
Thanks, of
Quran
course,
for the
of course,
patient
MC.
people. So you will be rewarded for being patient.
Ambassador, would you like to say a couple of things in the closing?
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you.